the first Souls game probably sold 500,000 copies. And
Right.
in our modern industry, that team would have immediately been, like deleted. 500,000 copies is just not enough. And yet that was enough for them. It was right. It was a right-sized investment for where they were, and they were able to take that into the next opportunity, the next opportunity, the next opportunity, and then you look up now and you get Elden Ring. I think more companies should be looking at that iterative approach to developing that team capability and that organizational expertise, and that being their takeaway from Elden Ring, as opposed to open world action RPG. I guess we need one of those too.
What type of game should you make if you're just kicking things off and new to development? How do you refine ideas and not get caught pursuing a dead end? What does a good relationship between product thinking and design look like throughout game dev? Today, I want to talk about early ideation and prototyping in game dev. This is a topic many developers and studios face as they try to create the next big thing, and I would describe the whole space as fraught with peril. While we won't be able to give you 100% guaranteed answers, I've got Omar Kendall here to help explore prototyping. Omar is a producer and product leader in game development. He's currently serving as an executive producer at Playgig, and he has a background in product and design. He's led many different types of game teams at THQ, Phoenix Labs, Riot, and Midway. So let's get into this. Omar, thank you so much for coming on. To get us kicked off, can you just give us a quick backstory of who you are?
Sure thing. And thanks for having me, Ben. Hi, folks. My name is Omar, and I've been making games pretty much my entire adult life. I grew up loving games, and I sometimes tell people that I kind of describe my background as sort of like before Street Fighter 2 and after Street Fighter 2, because I think it was a really important inflection point in my life where before Street Fighter 2, I had all kinds of different interests. I played baseball, read comic books, did all sorts of different childlike things, and then I played Street Fighter 2, and nothing was the same again. All I wanted to do was spend any quarter I could find in the arcades. I was hanging out in strange places with grown men. Just could not get enough of that video game, and it really changed my life. One of the best friends of my life I met in the arcades playing fighting games. We ended up like moving in together and writing strategy guides for fighting games together, actually, for one of the paper publishers back when people still paid money for strategy guides, and ended up using that strategy guide writing as a networking opportunity to land my first job in the games industry. I started as a games designer when I was like 22 years old or something like that. And then the rest was history. I've been in games development ever since. Started as a designer, eventually moved into more game direction type roles, before eventually crossing over into product management about 10 years ago. And now as an executive producer at Playgig. I'm still sort of really passionate about making the right things and making sure my teams are making awesome stuff for players. But now I do it with sort of like a purview on the entire production.
Cool. I love it. Okay. I want to kick us off talking about state of game dev today. We were just kind of going back and forth on this a little bit, but yeah, what do you see out there in game dev?
What I see is really scary. I think I'm not the only one who's observing a really aggressive and rapid consolidation. I'm seeing fewer bets made. I'm seeing fewer games teams out there making games. I think a lot of this has to do with, I think, some of the topics that we're going to get into lately, where I think a lot of publishers are experiencing the pain of some of the bad bets that they've made and some of the bad investments that they've made. And I think, lots of rank and file game developers are paying the price for that. But yeah, it's pretty dire out there, I'd have to say, especially as someone who, like myself, is really bullish on new games development. Personally, as a games developer myself, I like making new games. I like bringing new games to market. So it's exciting to me when I see a lot of investment in new games development, and it's sad for me when it's not there.
You said that you're seeing fewer game teams, and it's it struck me when you said that because one, I agree, and simultaneously more games than ever are being made. It's an interesting paradox there. It's not actually, but yeah, curious your thoughts on that as the number of games in the market just seems to go up and up and up and up.
Yeah, it is. I think it does sort of strike you as a paradox, especially when you can when you look. Listen, I'm on LinkedIn all the time, and I don't know what your feed looks like, but mine is inundated with just discourse about people who struggle to find work.
Yeah,
People who are at
yeah,
some of the biggest, most successful games companies in our industry who suddenly found themselves their projects and their teams being cut. And I think in any other normal gaming environment where those folks would have been able to turn around and find a job fairly easily because these are some of the most talented folks in our industry, they're really struggling.
hmm
It is a difficult paradox. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's dive into the main topic here, which is prototyping games. I pinged you. You wrote a really cool article.
Thank you.
And I loved how I think you brought the product thinking perspective with that article. And it was about, hey, where should you go if you're thinking about making a game? And it was almost like this, look, you could go anywhere. Hey, I've assembled a small team, whether we're an indie or whether we've got some seed funding or wherever we are, maybe we're an R&D in a giant, corporate company somewhere. Um, there's always this question, which is like, well, where are you trying to go? And yes, you would acknowledge that there might be external factors that would impact that. Like maybe there's a directive you have to follow if you're in that bigger corporate company. But you gave 3 criteria. If you want, I can just read them off real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
But if you want to, I'll let you state them. But yeah.
No, please
Um,
go ahead. Yeah.
okay. All right. And I thought these were really cool. So, the first, you want to go in opportunity spaces where the prototyping team has outsized expertise.
Yep.
Second, where there is clear opportunity for innovation. The third, where players have shown strong interest in experiencing something new.
Yeah.
I really like this because again, I hadn't seen a list like that seems so grounded in both practical and product approach to game development. So I'm curious, having said that, and with some, the shortest TLDR ever of your article, but like,
Sure.
how do you think about prototyping game? Why did you end up here?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the things I realized early in my career, remember I started as a game designer, was that I don't think I have a whole lot to say as a designer. I've worked alongside a lot of really, really, really talented designers. I'm not gonna go into the list because it's kind of crazy, but I've definitely had the privilege of working alongside some really talented folks. And they were all really strongly opinionated about the kinds of experiences that they wanted to make, and they sort of
Mhm.
oriented their careers in such a way as to make those games. Um,
Mm.
and I could feel them doing that. I could, as I was sitting alongside of them, I could feel sort of that like gravity pulling them towards these experiences that they felt really strongly about. I did not have that. I didn't have that inner voice that said, "Hey, this is my dream game, the thing that I sort of go home at night and tinker on." I just didn't have that. What I did have was a strong desire to make players happy with the games that I made. And so I think what that led me to do early on in my career is try to understand what kinds of games that players wanted. So instead of, I guess, looking inward to sort of an inner voice inside of me that was saying, make this game, I really tried to turn my ear towards the gaming audience at large, and I tried to understand what they were asking for. Um, and so I think that ultimately is why ended up in product, because
Mm-hmm.
product is really a role on teams where you're looking for game opportunities. You're trying to understand player taste and player trends, and you're trying to orient product to meet that demand instead of design. And I think, and this is a little um, personal, and I'm not going to go into like any individual case, but I've just seen a lot of really awesome teams who have really strong um, competencies around making like really specific and amazing experiences. Put that down to go chase, some other opportunity, um, and struggle. And I think there is a lot of value to be had in our industry if we try to aim game teams that are really good at making certain experiences at those audiences who are looking for them.
Yeah, I also won't name anybody, but I've also, especially in the consulting work, seen that same thing where, for whatever reason, because it seemed like a really good idea on a piece of paper or something, a team kind of starts running or starts, and they've perhaps already hired or are hiring, and what they're actually start going for is not the people that they hired. And
Yeah.
it's part of me goes like, well, that's okay if you're small enough, but
Sure.
you're gonna pay a cost to learn that,
Yeah.
and that's burn rate. And if you are already, 20, 25, 30 people, and now and you're making a game in Unity and nobody knows how Unity works, well, now
Right.
you're collectively paying the cost of like, well, we didn't have anybody who knew anything about Unity, so we're having to just, Google YouTube videos about how Unity works rather than just getting to like dive in there and iterate. And that was something you focused on heavily. Um,
Yeah.
in the article, you said around that first point of like, can we target something that this team already has outsized expertise in? And part
Yeah.
of that was related to that idea of like iteration,
Right.
and just rapid prototyping. Curious if you could expand on that at all, like where
Yeah.
again, like what brings you there?
Some of this is personal, sort of like my professional career and kind of what I've experienced, and some of it is what I see in the industry. And again, I'm not going to like call anyone out in particular, but I see, and this happens a lot in entertainment. I see a lot of kind of like reactionary investment. Oh, hey, this studio over here made a lot of money on superhero movies, and so we too should make superhero movies.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they'll extrapolate it one layer and say, oh, this company over here is investing a lot in IP. We too should invest a lot in IP. Um, and in doing so, I think they're responding to what they perceive as, an audience demand or interest in a certain product, which I think makes sense to an extent. Um, and they're really, really, really hoping that their organization can deliver on that audience demand. And I guess for me, instead of hope, what I'd like to see is more due diligence. If I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking, I guess I'll talk about my industry. I'd like to see more due diligence um, in the games teams that were sort of pointing at some of these problems. If you want to think about it another way, um, I think there is a virtue in teams that are able to stay together a really long time, learn
Mm-hmm.
how to work together, learn how to make games together. Um, and if all it takes is sort of trying to develop an understanding about what this team does well and to try to, I guess, get them to stretch a little bit further to go chase maybe something that they haven't made before, but leverages some of their organizational strength and historical expertise. Maybe that's more comfortable and maybe that's more ultimately more achievable. The comparison point that maybe I'd make is from software and sort of like the Souls games.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of folks will look at Elden Ring and say, "Oh, I want that." So I guess we should be making like a bunch of like open world action RPGs because that one made $1 billion, and they'll ignore all the games that they've made over the last 15 years that sort of
Yeah.
like led to that point where they were able to make that game. Um, the first Souls game probably sold 500,000 copies, and in
Right.
in our modern industry, that team would have immediately been you know, like delete it. Like there's no way they would have gotten another chance to make another video game. 500,000 copies is just not enough. And yet that was enough for them. It was right. It was a right sized investment for where they were, and they were able to take that into the next opportunity, the next opportunity, the next opportunity, and then you look up now and you get Elden Ring. I think more companies should be looking at that iterative approach to developing that team capability and that organizational expertise, and that being their takeaway from Elden Ring, as opposed to open world action RPG. I guess we need one of those too.
Yeah, I like that frame because I thought of the idea of Nintendo and how, gosh, someone's going to punch me for saying this, but how in some ways similar many of the early Nintendo games were to each other. But they weren't identical, and they were all actually pretty awesome. There's a reason Nintendo is where it's at.
Yeah.
But they follow a theme. And actually you see Nintendo leaning more and more and more into this idea of like, look, there's a place we play, and it is rated E for everyone, right? And we've gotten really good at that, and so that's where we focus. Like that's where we win, and they do.
I think that discipline's really admirable, and I think you've seen people, looking on the outside at Nintendo saying, well, why aren't you doing this? Like, why doesn't your...
Where's your Battle Royale, Nintendo?
Yeah, why don't you have a gajillion pixels being able to push, through your latest hardware? There's always this sort of comparison that's kind of begs the question, which is like, why aren't you doing something that someone else is good at?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, because we're good at something, and we're good at something that we think can really be valuable. I write about this in the article. I've got a very quirky background. I mentioned melee combat. Like me and the sort of folks that I've been able to convince to be my teammates over and over again throughout the years. Yeah, we have this kind of like weird and quirky specialization. And what I point out in the article is that, you've seen examples of melee combat in a bunch of different kinds of games. And that because my team has sort of been able to develop that skill throughout the years, that makes us really versatile, even though we seem to have like this sort of quirky and very specific focus, which is melee combat. But all sorts of different games, MOBAs, MMOs, fighting games, third-person action games. We were just talking about Elden Ring. Like, use this kind of combat to create like all of these different interesting experiences. And if you're really good at that sort of core competency, that core gameplay, then maybe you can take on new challenges. Like, okay, well, have you tried a live service? Have you tried sort of applying some of these, like the From Software games do in general? Have you thought about applying some of these fighting game concepts to, a third person action RPG type experience, and like what value might be extracted there? Like if you did, an example I give is sort of like, and I'm all over the place, so you have to forgive me, but
yeah, go for it.
If you got two athletes, okay, got one who is in the gym lifting weights every day, and I've got another who is a runner. They get up, they do their 3 miles every day. And I say, okay, I need to pick someone to go out and run a marathon. Now, neither one of these athletes runs marathons today.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to bet, well, which one is probably going to get to marathon running ability in the most efficient way? The choice is really obvious. The person who's kind of doing something like marathons.
Yeah.
And I sort of think, when we think about game opportunities, and like, let's imagine, okay, the superhero example, I'd really love it if we had a live service game too. Okay, maybe I don't have anyone in my organization who's ever made a live service game before, because that's kind of a new thing. But do I have to make the live service game that is completely unlike any of the other kinds of games that anyone in my organization has ever made before? Let's say I want to go, if we're looking, 10 years ago, crap, battle royales are coming out. I want a battle royale. if I don't have a single first person shooter or third person shooter like team at my company, like maybe that's just an opportunity I got to let go. Maybe I got to understand like, okay, there's probably some firm out there that's better positioned to take advantage of that opportunity than I am. Maybe
Right.
I'll go chase the next idea. I don't think, or I'm not convinced that sort of, and gosh, I'm spending a lot of time in this podcast talking about decisions that other people should make. But what I should say is like what I try to do as a product person,
Mm-hmm.
as someone who sort of is in charge of um, resources that are allocated in the organization to go out there and find some new value, is I try to make the case that like, hey, yeah, I don't have a team that's going to go make, a credible challenger to Fortnite because me and my team have never tried to make a third person shooter before. But hey, we have this interesting capability. Maybe this interesting capability can be leveraged in a live service context to extract some new value. Do you want
Yeah.
to give that a shot? That's a little bit closer for me and my team, and maybe we can get there and find something new and interesting. Are you interested in that? And I try to make the argument as compelling as possible to folks to sort of like cross that distance for them because that can be that can require some squinting and some legitimate skepticism, I think. But I think it's the conversations worth having.
There's a set of questions that popped for me as you were talking about it. One, I think these two are pretty well linked, and I'll forget the third one when we talk about these two, so that's good. So one is, how do you know what your team's good at?
Mm-hmm.
Because you described an experience, like your experience is, well, we've been working together for a long time. Not everybody has that. Maybe you have just brought some people together, or maybe we're being put together by the company, and we're worried that we're misaligned or whatever it is. And the second one is related, and we can take these in sequence or together. What do you view as the delta between what someone likes to play versus what they've developed?
What someone likes to play versus what they've developed?
Yes. As an example, my two big genres before I joined Riot were I'd say FPS, console FPS, and but FPS generally. And I'll just say strategy, but it went between like RTS and 4X. And then I started working on a MOBA, an isometric camera MOBA. And you can say like, well, that's kind of like the strategy, but it wasn't. Now I was playing League at the time, so I kind of get it pass. But like those are still to some extent the genres that I really engage with, even more so than MOBAs. And so anyway, I'm trying to, again, it's a very long question. I apologize for the length, but it's, how do you know what your team is good at? And is it important to have played or worked on or both? And like, how do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I can describe my path. My path was as a player who loved a certain kind of game. Let's use fighting games.
Mm-hmm.
As a player who loves a certain kind of game, I spent a lot of time trying to understand those games really deeply as a player.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost. And through that exploration, I think developed a sufficient level of understanding where me explaining what I think or what I perceive fighting games to be about and writing sort of like guides and useful tips on how to play them was worth something. And then I parlayed that sort of like insight and perspective into a design job. And my first several design jobs were all working on, if not fighting games, very fighting adjacent kind of experiences. So, I mean, my first project literally was a fighting game, but then I was working on like wrestling games and worked on the Ultimate Fighting Championship series for a while. And it was all sort of iterative steps from a sort of like core base of knowledge that I had like a lot of comfort and familiarity with. And then over time, I was able to kind of extrapolate or abstract a lot of those concepts and apply them to different experiences. I worked on League as well. And I kind of encourage a similar path for teams. I don't think I would make a fighting game today. As a matter of fact, I would many people that I love dearly work on fighting games today, but I don't think I could make a compelling argument to an organization for why, I should assemble a team to make the next great fighting game, because I just don't see the market. Like, just being absolutely candid, I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah.
sure that the market is really there for a new and amazing fighting game. And that's my kind of like responsibility as a product person. I'm saying, well, despite the fact that maybe I could assemble one of the best fighting game making teams in the world, I'm not sure if anyone would show up to play the game, and so I'm just not
Hmm.
going to do that. So
Hmm.
I think there is a level of kind of like responsibility that I have to just spend money wisely. But that iterative path of knowledge and being able to take that experience and begin to abstract it to more and more relevant experiences. And by relevant, I just mean experiences that players would be interested in playing. I think is really important for teams. It's really important for me. Um, a lifetime spent understanding fighting games has also given me, I think, a really strong foundational understanding of PvP and
Hmm.
why people play PvP and what makes
Hmm.
PvP really interesting and important and meaningful and complex and interesting. And so while I wouldn't necessarily go out and pitch or raise money to make the next great fighting game, I think there are a lot of really cool and interesting new PvP experiences that should exist, that I've developed like really strong opinions on and think I could build like really awesome teams to make.
That makes sense. I appreciate I do appreciate the sort of the description of your journey as like this may be a path. I recently finished Play Nice by Jason Schreier, which I think is a good book and it's worth a read. And having spent, we overlapped heavily at Riot. Um, there was a lot in there that was surprisingly similar between the two companies, or perhaps not surprisingly similar. I don't know.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but it just that jumped out at me. It was almost like it was almost sometimes like I was reading a book about Riot. But one of them was early on that focus on we're players first. Yes, we're game devs, but we're not game devs who like go home and don't touch games. We're players first. We play all the time. We have to stop playing to work, and that's okay. We accept that because we're working on games and it's awesome.
Yeah.
But don't ever get this confused with sort of the in the DNA of both of those companies very early on. And I believe that helped both of them succeed early on with early products and for
Yeah.
various reasons. With, you can make some arguments around what both of those companies did and what was different and what was the same. But so that's where, is it like, if you had somebody and they're like, oh, I'm an Unreal expert, but you're like, well, yeah, but you're not, you never play, you don't understand this genre.
Yeah.
So for me, it comes back to that, like, how do you know what your team is good at? How do you know what their skill is around? And I guess maybe just ask them, right? Like, what have you done? What
Yeah.
do you like? I don't know.
There's an anecdote that I talk about a lot. When I first worked on the Ultimate Fighting Championship series, actually, um, I hated the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Like, uh, I only applied for that job because, again, this was fairly early in my career, and I viewed it as an opportunity to apply fighting game mechanics and principles in this different context. So THQ at
Mm.
the time had the very successful wrestling franchise, and they were known for that franchise. And the series kind of offered a simulation of wrestling as experienced as a TV show, which I thought was really interesting. And the
Hmm.
video game did a lot to really make you feel like the product you were engaging with in the game was the product that you engaged with as a TV viewer. Um, when I started working on the UFC, like I said, I definitely bought in to all of the, I guess, the propaganda, the negative propaganda around the UFC as sort of like human cockfighting and being like somewhat like a brainless, kind of like thoughtless blood sport. There's this really famous image of like this, drunken guy at one of the fights. He's got like "just bleed" written on his forehead, and he's sort of like flexing drunkenly at the screen. And that was definitely my image of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And um, what I had to do as a designer, because I started as just a just combat designer on that video game, but what I needed to be able to do to be successful on that game was understand, well, why does anyone love the Ultimate Fighting Championship? I had to start
Mm-hmm.
with that question because I wanted people to love the game that I was going to make for them. And I don't think I could have been successful in that having this sort of like negative opinion or this disdainful opinion of like the sport or the people who enjoy it. And so yeah, I had to immerse myself in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I had to watch and any and all mixed martial arts broadcasts that I could. I had to learn the entire history of the UFC. I had to go to events. Um, I had to consume everything I could, and it gave me a really unique insight where I think from the outside, I viewed it as this blood sport and almost like a feral, sort of like primitive kind of obsession with violence. What I found is like the most hardcore and engaged UFC fans really deeply loved the commitment to this sort of pursuit of technical excellence. They were inventing
Mm-hmm.
something new.
Mm.
They were trying to find what is the most effective set of combat tools to leverage against an opponent when you just ask that open-ended question. And so you had all of these different practitioners of all of these different martial arts, boxers, wrestlers, Muay Thai, jujitsu, what have you, and they were all sort of coming together. And at that point, they had figured out, oh, we need to start cross-pollinating and hybridizing, and sort of we have to learn. I can't just be a full boxer. You can't just be a full wrestler. We have to sort of like learn these different skills and figure out what the best solution is. And the audience was highly aware of this too. They were
Mm-hmm.
highly engaged. They sort of understood the fighters. They understood their backgrounds. You'd be watching these like intricate dances of two fighters who are moving through different positions. And if you're not aware of what's happening, you might just see some knee pass over a thigh and be like, I don't know what just happened. But the crowd like roars. And you're
Right.
like, wait,
Right.
what? And it just opened my eyes that the core audience here was just this super insightful and plugged in and connected viewer, and that's what they would be looking for out of the video game. And so we ended up making like this really like hardcore, like super technical video game that like it was really a really hard sell within the organization, who again, they're used to selling this very like simulation style sort of like wrestling game. And we were like, no, we're going like all in with this extremely like complex sort of fighting system because we think that's what players want, or at least the audience, the UFC audience wants. And it ended up being absolutely true. Like it's like a hugely successful series. I know EA took over the series and still makes them today. But the thing that uh, players and reviewers resonated with most strongly during that time was just how faithful we were to sort of that technical pursuit. And that's just not an insight I would have been able to leverage in the game had I not done the work to understand what I was making and who I was making it for. And I just fundamentally believe that teams have to do that work. It's really hard for me to say that games makers have to be gamers. Um, but I, at the same time, it's really hard for me to imagine a games team that doesn't deeply understand who they're making a game for
Yeah.
being successful at making a game for that audience.
So that kind of pivots us a little bit into second point,
Yeah.
or perhaps I don't know, second and third, because the first point was you want to go into opportunity spaces where the prototyping team has outsized expertise,
Yep.
and then number two, where there is clear opportunity for innovation, and number three, where players have shown strong interest in experiencing something new.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to take these together or one at a time. I guess I'll leave that to you. But these both sit in that space of like, I read those and I was like, that there was something in them that was like, that seems right to me. And
Yeah.
simultaneously, I was going, but man, I could see like people going, well, every place has clear opportunity for innovation, or like, well, players will show interest in something new if you give it, when you're thinking about that and you're applying that lens.
Yeah.
I'm gonna key off on the idea of you have to select and then get to know the audience you're trying to hit. And so
That's
there's
right.
probably some amount of conversation we could have there about like, how do you even, you're trying to make a new game. How do you know or make a guess at what your audience will be? And then how do you, because you need to do that first before you can know them. And then like, what do you know? How do you know that they've shown strong interest in something new or whatever it might be?
Yeah, this is tricky. And I fully admit that, and I even say this in my article, that this is not a one size fits all approach to game development. I know that there are
Mm-hmm.
a lot of, intuitive teams and developers out there who just really they listen to their hearts, or they make the games that they want to play. I hear that all the time.
Yep.
And these are obviously like tried and true and successful methods for making games. Again, I don't have that inner voice, and so I can't rely on that um, to find my next game opportunity. So for me, and yeah, we can talk about 2 and 3 together. I think how I think about it, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, was okay, I've got a team who can make a game. Um, I fundamentally believe that, like, because I have this experience as a player, um, if I have a game that I enjoy, what I'm looking for is not the exact same game from some other team that I can just sort of have an additive experience with. I'm like, no, I already have this thing and I'm going to consume it and I'm going to love it and it's going to be great. But then I'm going to be a different person after I consume this thing. My tastes will be fundamentally different. And so I probably need a product that meets not who I was, but who I am today. And so, in the same way that, like, the reason I was saying, like, I can't figure out like a new fighting game idea, for instance, is because I don't think what I'm trying to do is make a game for someone who's really enjoying fighting games today. I'd either want to make a game for someone who has never enjoyed a fighting game before,
Mm-hmm.
or someone who is tired of fighting games and is looking for
Mm-hmm.
the next thing in their sort of experiential journey now that they've played fighting games. And that to me is how I sort of describe like the clear opportunity. So there's either got to be like clear market signal that there's a whole bunch of players who are really interested in a new experience on one end of that spectrum for me to think, oh, okay, there's opportunity here. Um, if there's just one big game or two big games that are out there and they've sort of like carved out these huge massive pies, and they're maybe the only two instantiations examples of those games having success, it might be difficult for me to think, that this is how I sort of supplement that, this is how I can like add to and expand, I can chase the market on sort of like one end or the other. So like that really, there really needs to be signal there, um for signal of innovation there for me to like find a clear opportunity to pursue. The um the last one is tricky, that sort of demonstrated interest. I learned this lesson, I think, very viscerally at Riot because we tell this story so much about Dota. Um, I was not a Dota player. I was a huge Warcraft 3 player, a huge Frozen Throne player, and I had played Dota. Like, I'd gotten to
Mm-hmm.
that point in Frozen Throne where we're like, okay, well, we're bored. We've played our 1 billionth game. We're just sort of hanging out, and someone says, oh, hey, have you played Dota? I'm like, no, I haven't played Dota. And then I played it, and I was like, cool, that was Dota. And didn't, it didn't hit me. And I guess, like, because I had my player lens on, it didn't hit me as this obvious opportunity, but it did for, our founders. Like, they saw it. They felt the hunger of the audience. Um, and they saw how the audience was contorting themselves to engage with that experience, even though there was only a
Yeah.
tiny amount of them. There was just a tiny amount of them, but they weren't reacting to their size, they were reacting to their intensity. And I tend to look for that a lot as well. I tend to look
Mm.
for, where do I see an intense, outsized effort to engage with an experience, even if that group of people, the amount of people who are engaging with that thing isn't necessarily that big. Um, and this requires, again, as a product person, I'm looking at the modding communities, I'm looking
Yeah.
at indie games, I'm always looking at sort of like the different sort of like lesser serviced parts of our gaming community, and I'm trying to discover what experiences that they themselves are showing that high effort and intensity for. And if there's not someone out there that's serving them, at scale,
Yeah.
um, that's a really attractive opportunity to me.
There's so many things that were shooting through my mind as you were talking, because I've thought a lot about genres. And I'm not a designer or a product thinker, but I've thought a lot about genres as they've moved over time. And I think RTS and fighting games are, to me, these two things that, like, they both sort of had their time of being the big thing, or at least a big chunk. And then they kind of both got eaten by a changing marketplace and a changing player. Um, and I think there's a part, I'm sure you feel this is like a Street Fighter 2, but one of the ones like I grew up on was StarCraft and StarCraft Brood War
Sure.
and stuff like that. And like just a lot of games like that. And there's a part of me that just out of pure nostalgia is just like, man, could someone make a game like that? But the problem is it's an immature thought, because
Yeah.
the odds of them actually making something that's better than Brood War is very low, because that's a really great game. Um, and that time period, I think, is past, and RTSs have been eaten by tower defense and MOBAs and like a set of other things. Even your sort of auto battlers, I think, kind of fill some sort of space that
Yeah.
people used to go to strategy for. And I haven't thought as much about fighting, but as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about like that idea of how many people were wasting so much time fighting Arma 2 servers to play DayZ.
Perfect example. Yeah.
And 'cause Aaron would always bring this up. He's just like there's something here, because people will deal with all this crap to try to play this game. And then same thing as Battle Royale started becoming a thing. And H1Z1 kind of tickled that a little bit, and then PUBG just nailed it. But immediately after, Spaces for Innovation, Warzone
Right.
is meaningfully different from PUBG, whereas PUBG has much more of the simulation element. Warzone it's Call of Duty, but it has their engine, that feel, that way of operating, but actually done in a pretty slick way.
Yeah.
And then you have the other one that I think is still around and living is Apex Legends, and that one, it very different, like pacing and everything else, but same overall idea.
Yeah.
And it's so anyway, that one is an interesting one where you saw, because I think you did see players playing PUBG who, one, were super excited to have this experience at all, but then to that idea of like that hunger for something new, there was also this, man, could someone make this like cleaned up so I didn't have to load bullets into my gun every time I pick one up that like came with ammo in it, or just little simple things that, again, were actually, I think, and you could disagree with this, were wrong for what PUBG was trying to be, but were right for that other game.
Yeah.
Whatever it would be. And that's just one example. Obviously that wasn't the design innovation of those other products, but but yeah, there's something there around like that shifting and that like looking, and still that's tough. That's so tough.
That point that you bring up is one that I feel really strongly about. This idea that, like, I mean, there are people who are making RTSs today. And I think it's predicated on one, a love for the genre. It's one of my favorite genres. But to me, the bet only makes sense if there's an audience today who is like, yes, the RTS experience is where we are in terms of like what we want to be playing today. To me, it's not even a question of, can we make a game as good as Brood Wars? Because I don't think that would actually be the determining factor as to whether or not that game is successful today. Is today's audience interested in Brood Wars? And I think that can be a really hard question to answer. Again, if you're moving more off of like intuition or like your experience, and like, well, this is the thing that I want to see, so I have to assume that there's an audience out there who wants to see it as well. I think there's an additional level of external validation that I think teams do themselves a favor in going through.
you mentioned earlier that so the idea of intuition, and it's certainly not a bad move to you know write the story you'd want to read or make the movie you'd want to watch or create the
Yeah,
game you'd want to play. I think what I'll call out, I think survivorship bias comes in pretty strongly there, because I think a lot of people have actually done that. They're like, this is the game
yeah,
I want to play, and there's not an audience. And I
right.
think for me, if you're realizing that's true, let's say you've somehow, you're relatively modern in your approach, and you're actually doing some level of validation, and you're realizing like the game I want to play is not the game other people want to play. Or
Yeah,
at least I can't find this audience. I don't know who they are. And so
yeah,
unfortunately now I have to go to a place of doubting my intuition. And I have to go, and this is where I like kind of the article you wrote. And I like how you were breaking this down, because yes, it is a valid approach to make the thing you want to play, but it fails. And we
yeah,
can stare all day at the successes of that because there's many. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
But what if you realize it's failing and now you're going, well, shoot, I was prototyping this and I did some stuff, and I'm kind of selling everybody on this dream of like, this is the game we all want to play, right? But it turns out
sure.
that I can't find anybody else.
Yeah,
Now I need to do a pivot, or outside of like shutting down the team or studio or whatever. I need to do a pivot into like, okay, well, what will we do?
yeah,
And going into these places of like, well, where are players excited? Um, and maybe not a ton, but where are they passionate? Where are they punching down walls? I also love that you called out the mod community, because I think the mod community is such a great example of actually how I think large companies should relate to live service products. Is that like you start this really small, and you start like engaging with the community around a very early product, and then they're going to give you a lot of feedback. Like Counter-Strike still exists. Dota in its new forms of League of Legends and Dota 2 still exists.
yeah,
Everybody that tried to do direct copies of those that didn't that did the thing that you were talking about earlier, which is like, oh, they came out with a blah type of game. Well, we better have one too, because we're a big game company and we need to, and it's like, no, the FromSoft thing of like, they are such an example. Like, I don't like Dark Souls games. I still bought
hmm,
Elden Ring. I
sure.
played Elden Ring. I beat a couple of bosses. It's still not my thing. I'm not offended or bothered that I bought the game. It's a
Right.
good game, and I enjoyed it. And again, was it me for like the long haul and getting all the way to the end and like following this? No, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the co-op aspects of it. Like I enjoyed running around their world. Um, and it was just like I was just impressed actually as a gamer playing this. It's like, this is really cool and really well done. Um, but again, it was that one that was like they hit an audience with Elden Ring that was not the Dark Souls player.
Right.
That it wasn't
Very
just
true.
pure Dark Souls. It suddenly it like broadened appeal somehow, and a bunch of little subtle things they did. So I'm
Yeah.
not going anywhere with any of this. I'm rambling on, but
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah.
Well, there was a point that you hit on earlier, which is sort of like, a team is in development and they sort of find themselves, I guess, that they've made something that maybe they find out, oh, players don't want this.
Mhm.
The trick is to find that out as soon as possible.
Mhm.
Like the trick is not to avoid that scenario entirely. I actually think that's probably impossible, right? And my guidance here in this framework is not a surefire, guaranteed way to make nothing but certified bangers for the rest of your career. It's for me,
Darn it! Everybody just turned
it
off the podcast, Omar.
yeah. Sorry, it's risk mitigation, and I describe it as such. This is just my way of mitigating risk. Let me play to my strengths, and let me go look for opportunities of innovation in places where there's demonstrable player interest. Let me sprint as fast as I can towards a playable experience that I can put in front of real players and validate my assumptions around. Um, I don't get into a ton of this in the article, but that particular project that I wrote about and referenced was one of the smallest development teams I've ever been a part of. It was one of the cheapest product projects that I've ever funded. Um, and it was one of the funnest experiences that we ever made, that I've ever worked on as a developer.
Mhm.
Um, the first thing that we prioritized was a demonstrable, playable prototype of that experience. And we made it with like, gosh, 7 people or something like that. 7 people, including me, and I'm useless when it comes to like early game development, right? I can't actually build anything. Um, and it was fun. It was fun from the first sprint. The first sprint, we had a 2D abstracted sort of like top-down version that was just proving out the game mode. We were sort of like inventing a new style of play, and we were like, well, we don't really know what this game mode is like. We don't know if it's going to be fun, but we know we shouldn't have to wait until we've built dozens and dozens of complex systems and high fidelity characters and different assets before we can realize that. There's probably some version of this that we can build to understand the fun of this new game mode that we're thinking about. And so we built it in 2 weeks and we were playing it, and it was fun. And it was good enough to move on to the next sort of unknown or project risk that we had. And we iterated in that manner, until we had a prototype with dozens of people running around in a 3D environment with melee combat. And it was great. And I think you have to reach that point of that sort of playable, and you just have to put it in front of people, and you have to respect what they say. You have to actually like use the process of player validation as a tool in your product development. If you look at players and they don't like what you're making, and you say, "Well, maybe the players are wrong," I think you're just being delusional. Again, you can probably make a great game that way. I'm sure there's many developers who have just blown through playtests and ignored what the players said and released successful product. Again, I'm preaching risk mitigation.
Yeah.
This is my way of making sure to the organization and to myself that I'm being honest, that I'm trying to develop something that players want to play.
There's an idea I have of like you're trying to tip the odds, right? You're trying to put your thumb on the scale as best you can on the success side. And while, to your point, there's somebody out there who ignored all the feedback that their game sucked and they were just like, no, it just needs this one other thing, and once I get that in, it's gonna all click and it's gonna be amazing. And they were right, and the game is now
right.
And like that totally, I'm sure that's happened. Simultaneously, survivorship bias. How many other people stubbornly stuck to a plan, like what they had in their head, ignored everything, kept rolling, and then went, oh shoot, and maybe to the point of actually even shipping a game and spending all that money and building up that team, and dragging other people along, perhaps willingly, but just then you like get to the end and you're just like, oh, nobody likes this. Well, that sucks. Hey everyone, we're going to keep talking to Omar Kendall next time, but for now I want to do a quick summary of what we've covered so far. A few points to go through. First, take seriously whether you have an inner voice guiding the games you want to make, or you get that from something else, perhaps a leader at your company or from the gamers out there in the world. It will impact the teams and games you want to work on. Second, keeping teams together and pointed at problems where they have expertise gives you an advantage over chasing trends or going at something your team has little experience in. History matters, your teams as well, and being amazing at 4X games doesn't mean you can crush arena shooters. Don't chase stuff that other teams are good at just because they succeeded at it. Third, to add some nuance to what I just said, staying focused too narrowly can also be a mistake. Don't think that you can only make 4X games because that's what you've always done. How can you apply those skills, but expand the space to operate in? Especially when the existing space is full and you don't have anything innovative to aim for, how can you leverage the team's history and expertise to shoot at something new while still taking advantage of the unique lessons you've gained? That can be a great target to aim for. Fourth, think about if anyone is going to show up to play the game you are making. No matter how good or bad you are at it, are you targeting something players want to play or chasing something else? If the latter, don't expect too much, even if you ship. Fifth, even if you don't understand or even enjoy the IP or the game you are working on, take the time to both respect your audience and seek to understand them. You may be surprised when you realize it wasn't what you thought, and it will increase your chances of making something they are excited to play. Sixth, an idea for finding an idea and really an audience. Are you attempting to attract totally new players to something that is known to be engaging, or are you trying to grab people who are tired of a formula and pull them towards something new? If either of these is where you're at, that's good. If neither, are you really creating something people will choose to play? Seventh, when thinking about prototyping, find the intent signal, even if it's not that many players. When you see players jumping through hoops to engage with an idea because no one has done it yet, well, that's more likely going to be an idea worth pursuing. Eighth, find out as fast as you can whether the game you are making is engaging for real players. The sooner you know this, the sooner you can double down or make necessary pivots to give you a shot at success down the road. Assuming the players are wrong is a low odds gamble. All right, thanks for listening. See you next time.